day. Next week, the Russians and Americans sit down for negotiations on the 10th of January in Geneva to talk about strategic stability and to discuss the various proposals the Russians have made for seeking security guarantees, legally binding security guarantees from the United States and from NATO in Europe. Just to summarize, the Russians are demanding a legally binding guarantee that NATO will not be further extended eastward. They want, obviously, a decision by NATO, by the United States, that they will not bring countries like Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. They want the decision made at the Bucharest summit in 2008 by NATO to invite Ukraine and Georgia one day to join NATO. They want that invitation to be scrapped. They also want all US and NATO infrastructure to be dismantled and withdrawn from Eastern Europe, from the territories of the former Soviet alliance, the Warsaw Pact, from those countries of the former Warsaw Pact that were once part of, which are now part of NATO. And they want further agreements, they want further commitments from the United States that the United States will withdraw all its nuclear forces from Europe and indeed from around the world, including from places like Turkey and presumably Japan as well, and South Korea as well. So a massive list of demands from the Russians, backed by 2 draft treaties, and with the Russians, as I have discussed in various previous videos, making it very clear that these are not topics for philosophical discussion. These are from them a list of demands. Now, this, as I said, is an extraordinary situation, one that the United States is not accustomed to finding itself in. It's not faced a negotiation as tough and as grueling as this with another power since arguably the days of the Paris peace negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam during the period of the Vietnam War. And one can see bewilderment and bafflement in the United States about how to deal with this list of demands, taken together with a growing sense that the United States has seriously overreached, that NATO has seriously overreached, and as a result, because of those past mistakes that NATO has made going all the way back to the 1990s, and which the United States has made going back all the way to the 1990s, it goes into the negotiations in Geneva from a weak position. Now, before I get on to discussing the negotiations and what might possibly happen, and that's problematic to guess for the moment, it might be worth saying a few things about the actual people who are going to head the delegations, the 2 delegations. As I guessed some days ago, the Russian delegation is going to be headed by Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Now, he's been an extremely outspoken official recently in discussing these issues, and he has a reputation for being both a details man, somebody with a masterly grip on his brief, and he's, of course, a highly trained professional diplomat. But he is also apparently something of a bruiser, or at least what the British call a bruiser. That is somebody who can speak very forthrightly and very clearly, and who takes no prisoners in arguments. So that's the sort of person that the United States, that the US delegation is going to be up against in these talks, in these forthcoming talks in Geneva. Who is going to head the US delegation? Well, it's going to be Wendy Sherman, a person who does have some diplomatic experience, but who is, of course, far from being a full-time professional diplomat. It is also the same Wendy Sherman who was bulldozed over by the Chinese in that disastrous summit in Tianjin, which took place in July, and following which the US State Department pretended that she had had talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, when in reality she had talks with a far less senior official, Xie Feng, who is hardly comparable, certainly not the Chinese Foreign Minister. And I pointed out in a video in which I covered that disastrous summit that it was the State Department unable, apparently, to accept the humiliation of having Wendy Sherman talk to Xie Feng, pretended in a readout that her discussions had been with Wang Yi, the foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister, when they were, of course, in reality, with this less senior official, Xie Feng. By the way, lest you think that I was the only person who thought that meeting in China, in Tianjin, in July, was a disaster, there is an article in Foreign Policy magazine, one of the most important magazines of the US foreign policy establishment, perhaps the most important magazine of the US foreign policy establishment, which reads, its title is "Sherman's China Visit Was a Quiet Disaster." So there you go. This is the person who's going to be pitted against Sergei Ryabkov and his expert team of diplomats and lawyers and military people, and who's going to be facing up against him in Geneva on the 9th of January, with talks going on, continuing on the 9th and 10th of January, and perhaps beyond that. Anyway, that doesn't, it seems to me, promise many good outcomes, but it does betray a fundamental truth of the nature of the negotiations. And that is that the United States and the Western powers are coming to these negotiations without a coherent or clear negotiating strategy. If they have one, I'm quite unable to see what it is. And that perhaps explains an utterly bizarre, indeed surreal press conference that NATO's ideologically fixated Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg held a few days ago, directly following a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. It was impossible for me to make much coherent sense of what he was saying. On the one hand, he seemed to accept that meaningful negotiations with the Russians are about to start. He also, in a kind of a way, seemed to accept that those negotiations are going to be primarily between the Russians and the United States, with NATO and the European allies very much bit players, tagged along after the main talks between the two great powers take place. At the same time, he seemed to find it impossible to compromise on anything substantive. All the blame was on the Russians. The Russians were being criticized for everything. They are the people who supposedly are creating the crisis and the tensions in Europe. He made the extraordinary claim at one point in the press conference that the expansion of NATO has been a source of stability and peace in Europe, in which case some of us might ask, why in that case are we in this crisis? Why are there all these fears of a possible war in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine? Why is NATO obliged, if the situation in Europe is so peaceful and so stable following NATO's expansion, why are we in a position where NATO and the United States have been forced to sit down and talk to the Russians about legally binding security guarantees? And at the same time, as he was coming up with all these chaotic comments and still talking about the fact that NATO has a right to expand and apparently expand without limit and to every possible point in the compass, except presumably, apparently, Russia itself. Even as he was saying that, he was coming up with some incredible plaintive comments, which, to be straightforward about it, I found almost sad in the way in which they exposed the extraordinarily weak position in which he was negotiating from. At least the Western powers seem to be negotiating from. He made, for example, a really bizarre point right at the start of his press conference about how NATO cannot have a two-tier alliance. How you can't have, I will quote his exact words, we cannot end up in a situation where we have kind of second-class NATO members, where NATO as an alliance is not allowed to protect them in the same way as we protect other allies. I mean, who is he trying to convince? The Russians? Are the Russians going to be concerned about that? Why should the Russians be worried about whether NATO has two-tier alliances? Is a two-tier alliance? Clearly, this is an internal argument. He's reflecting here an internal argument that appears to be happening within NATO and within Western governments. There seem to be some people who are talking about some kind of withdrawal of Western forces from Eastern Europe. And we see how Stoltenberg, with these words, appears to be pleading with them not to do it. And we can tell, in fact, why he is making this plea, because over the last few hours, there was a release of information from NBC that the United States is indeed going to propose to the Russians some sort of reciprocal pullback of forces. The United States supposedly pulling back forces from Eastern Europe in return for Russia pulling back its own forces from, well, where precisely? Apparently from its own territory, something which, of course, the Russians have already ruled out. To be very clear, the Russians have already said that they're in no mood to make reciprocal compromises. And one of the extraordinary things about Stoltenberg's press conference was his constant pleas to the Russians to agree reciprocal compromises so that every retreat that NATO makes is supposedly or must supposedly be matched by an equivalent Russian retreat. But the Russians have already rejected that. They have said, and Putin himself has said, that Russia has nowhere to retreat to. It made all the big concessions. At the time when the Cold War ended, it pulled back its forces from Central and Eastern Europe in return for promises from NATO not to expand eastward, promises from NATO not to position NATO forces in the territories of the former Warsaw Pact. And it is NATO and the United States which has reneged on all those promises. So why, in return for the Russians insisting that those promises now be made at least real up to a point, why then expect the Russians to make concessions to the Americans, to NATO, in order to help the United States and NATO out of difficulties, when so far as the Russians are concerned, they already made in the past all those big concessions, all those big retreats. By the way, I've seen some people talk about the Russians also agreeing to respect Ukraine's neutrality as some sort of deal between the United States and Russia, that Ukraine should not join NATO. Well, Ukraine had a provision in its constitution that it would remain a neutral state. And that, of course, that provision was, of course, rescinded. Why should the Russians, therefore, be minded to revisit this issue? Why should they agree to any provision for Ukraine's neutrality in return for an agreement by the United States not to extend NATO eastwards, when previous promises about Ukraine's neutrality have been shown to be absolutely worthless? So this is a good example. This press conference and some of these suggestions that have been floating around illustrate, again, it seems to me, the incoherence of NATO's negotiating strategy as it moves into these negotiations. And lest you think that this is my own view and that I'm the only person who says this, we have an extraordinary article about this in no less a place than the Financial Times, a newspaper which, as I said previously, is very attuned to thinking within the Biden administration. It is regularly used now by senior officials in the Biden administration, our usual friends, the anonymous officials, to publicize information on security and defense issues like, for example, the Chinese hypersonic glide vehicle test of a few weeks ago. Well, this time, the Financial Times has an article which, again, is incredibly plaintive and shows once more the weak hand that the West has, and its inability as it goes into these negotiations to come up with a coherent negotiating policy. Now, like all articles in the Financial Times, it is behind a paywall, so I'm only going to read out parts of it. But it starts off with the words, US-Russia summit on European security sounds Cold War echo. And then the subtitle reads, Vladimir Putin goes into Geneva talks with strong hand as West struggles to present united front. And then the article goes on to read, Russia arrives at the table on Monday with more than 100,000 troops stationed menacingly on the border of neighboring Ukraine and has threatened military action if the talks come to nothing. And that this, the Financial Times tells us, is part of Moscow's leverage. Now, I should say, these 100,000 troops that this article talks about, Stoltenberg in that press conference talked about it at vast length as well. They don't exist. Ukraine has once again confirmed that they are not stationed, Russian troops are not stationed in any vast numbers on Ukraine's border. But it is the case that the Russians are now building up base facilities, not on Ukraine's border, but some distance from it. And they show every ability and indication of being ready to act and act fast if there is a need to act in Ukraine. And that is, I think, much more than anything else, what is spooking and alarming the West. And of course, we've just had a further demonstration of how fast the Russians can act. Riots happen in Kazakhstan, and within hours, Russian peacekeepers, Russian troops, are being deployed to that country. A process which one suspects would take the Western powers days, perhaps a week, to sort out. The Russians are able, in this area, in their own region, in countries on their border, they're able to respond to and act upon them within hours. But then, to return to the Financial Times article, more importantly, President Vladimir Putin has already achieved the goal of forcing the United States to discuss a slew of demands that would reshape Europe's security architecture, with few areas of possible agreement that would not look like Western capitulation. And then we have a quote from somebody called Judy Dempsey, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, and she says, Putin is going into these talks with a very strong hand. I think this meeting is misjudged. the summit would only yield marginal success if the West went in united together and they had a serious negotiating strategy. And they don't have one. That's Judy Dempsey. And then she goes on to say that Russia views Europe through the Cold War prism of a continent bisected between superpowers, which conflicts with the US and European vision forged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then she goes on to say how the Americans are going to actually square this circle is going to be very difficult. Putin is of the old school and will not give up on what Judy Dempsey calls spheres of influence. Again, I think this is a misunderstanding of Russian objectives, by the way, but it does point to the fundamental problems, how incredibly difficult it is for the US to accept these Russian demands. I'm going to come to that in a moment, but at the same time, the fact that the United States has found itself in a position where it is obliged to talk about these things. And then the Financial Times quotes another expert, Tatiana Sotova, who is the founder of Our Politic, a Kremlin-focused political consultancy. I have to say, I've never heard of her, and I've never heard of her consultancy, but never mind. And she says, and in this, Ms. Sotova and I, or whoever she is, are in full agreement, the very fact that security guarantees are being discussed at all is a huge breakthrough for Russia. It's never happened before. And then the article goes on to say, for US negotiators led by Assistant Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, a de-escalation of the Ukrainian crisis is the primary goal. But how to achieve this without giving their Russian counterparts a prize to take home to Moscow that would weaken the security of Kiev or NATO allies in Eastern Europe appears a perilous task. And then the article goes on to say Biden is under growing pressure to defuse a crisis that threatens to ensnare his administration as it is trying to focus on other issues, mainly tackling the surging pandemic and calming inflation. At the same time, the White House knows that any suggestion of it having caved to Russian demands would undermine its own claims of standing up to authoritarian leaders, likely trigger a bipartisan backlash on Capitol Hill, and ring alarms among allies around the world that rely on US security guarantees. Now, and then the article goes on to say, complicating Sherman's brief is the absence from the talks of both Ukraine and the EU, both of which have demanded a role in the talks, but have been successfully sidelined by Moscow. US officials have repeatedly stressed that no discussion of Ukraine can take place without Ukraine present, and that European security was a matter for Europe and NATO. But ruling out both of those topics at the bilateral meeting would leave little to discuss. The coordination between the US and Europe is complicated by persistent divides within the EU over both how to handle Russia and Brussels' role in the continent's defence and security. France and Germany, who held their own talks in Moscow this week, are viewed with scepticism by some EU states, which see them as too willing to follow an accommodation with the Kremlin. France is also leading a push to expand the US's EU strategic autonomy and defence capabilities, a move which is opposed by other member states who reject anything that would weaken NATO's role as the primary security guarantee. And then we have a quote, again from Judy Dempsey. The US and the Europeans need a shopping list of what they want, not just what Russia wants. This summit is precisely about what Russia wants. We still do not know what the West wants. We are going to the table with nothing, absolutely nothing, in our hands. Now, the problem which Judy Dempsey simply can't face and admit to is that the United States knows this. It knows that it is coming to this negotiation from playing from a desperately weak hand. But it has had to sit down and do it because practically, in all practical terms now, it has no essential choice. The situation in Ukraine is becoming increasingly unstable. The military balance in Europe is shifting steadily in Russia's favor, and the sanctions weapon that has been so much talked about could catastrophically backfire, especially if it puts in jeopardy energy supplies to Europe at a time when there are already energy shortages in Europe and at a time when there is a general inflation crisis. Looming over everything is the further reality of US strategic overstretch, the fact that the US is facing an increasing and sustained challenge in the Far East from China. So what does the United States do in this situation? I suspect, very much on the urging of some people, especially in the Pentagon, it has no real option, no realistic option, but to sit down and talk, even though it has no clear understanding of what it can offer, because it has made all sorts of commitments and struck all sorts of rhetorical poses, which it would be politically incredibly difficult to retreat from. Now, there's been a brilliant article about all of this, about the weak position that the West has in coming to these negotiations, from the former Canadian diplomat Patrick Armstrong, who is an excellent, if I may say, an outstanding expert and analyst of Russian affairs, the sort of person who it would be very wise and very good if Western officials and indeed Western media would occasionally listen to, but they never do. And he explains, I think, extremely well the many problems that the West has. And he does this by taking apart and demolishing article, a piece published by that well-known neocon, NATOist outfit, the Atlantic Council, which talks about how the West must make no concessions to Russia on any topic, especially not Ukraine, but then goes on to, in that same article, expose its empty hand. And Armstrong puts it like this: these guys think Moscow appears to be setting the stage for launching a major conventional assault on Ukraine. The signers are the usual Putin whisperers, none very highly connected to reality. The lead singer suggested that Ukraine should invite the United States and NATO to send a fleet of armed ships to visit Mariupol. They'd better be pretty small ships. The sea is very shallow. It's absolutely true, by the way. Large displacement ships cannot sail in the Sea of Azov. There is the option of sending a battle fleet to the Sea of Azov to Mariupol. Simply doesn't exist. Anyway, to continue, however pitiful their suggestions, one may take comfort from the fact that they do not suggest that the USA, NATO go to war with Russia if it invades Ukraine, the truth of which one signer has some dim awareness is simple. If USA, NATO get into a conventional war with Russia, they will lose. If USA, NATO get into a nuclear war with Russia, everybody will lose. Therefore, there is no war solution for USA, NATO. That is exactly right. And in that very same chaotic, muddled press conference of Jens Stoltenberg's, which I have just been discussing at the start of the programme, he admits in effect the same thing. He doesn't put it in quite these words, but he again makes clear that if there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, the NATO and the United States will stand aside. They will not come to Ukraine's defence in the event of such a war. And then to continue with Patrick Armstrong's article, what do they suggest? What are the immediate steps to affect the Kremlin's cost-benefit calculations? Raising the costs. Only worn-out repetition of past failures. One may be encouraged because it shows the paucity of thought among the warmongers, but at the same time discouraged because it shows their paucity of thought. Stasis, decay, petrification, but never a reflective silence. Here they are. 1. A package of major and painful sanctions. 2. Enhance the deterrent strength of Ukraine's armed forces. 3. NATO should act now to begin bolstering its military presence on its eastern flank. 4. USA NATO should utter statements and hold consultations to highlight the unacceptability. It's a particularly fatuous one, by the way. 5. The United States and its NATO allies should continue to make their readiness for dialogue with Russia to conclude concerns of NATO and other parties about Russian military and other aggressive activities. That last paragraph, paragraph 5, by the way, is directly out of Jens Stoltenberg's copybook. His press conference reads like a extension of that paragraph. Yes, NATO is prepared to sit down and negotiate with Russia, and they're prepared to engage with a dialogue with Russia, but it must always be about NATO's concerns about Russia's military and other aggressive activities. But never mind, to continue with Armstrong. All that need to be said about still more sanctions on Russia is that the EU is claiming to the World Trade Organization right now about the effectiveness of Russian counter-sanctions and counters to the sanctions Europe imposed on it because of alleged past sins. That's also true. By the way, the United States is doing the same thing. They're actually complaining to the World Trade Organization, of all places, about the Russian success in carrying out an effective counter-sanctions strategy. To continue, in a word, sanctions have made Russia stronger. Food is the most obvious example, but there are plenty of others. The latest being forcing the Russian aircraft industry to home-produce wings and engines for the MS21 aircraft. Food, of course, is a dramatic change. Russia has, since the sanctions were imposed on it in 2021, not only achieved effective food self-sufficiency, it is now arguably the world's swing wheat exporter. A dramatic change in just a few years. As for the MS-21 aircraft, this is a new narrow-body aircraft, the first of a new fleet of Russian and Chinese civil aircraft that is coming into service. As Patrick Armstrong correctly says, it's going to be powered by Russian engines, the PD-14 engine, which has now been perfected and is entering service. And what he refers to is what he's mentioning here are the wings. The wings were made are made of composite materials. The first, apparently, the first wings of an aircraft of this nature made in such a way, at least in a civil aircraft. The United States tried to impose, through sanctions, blocks on the export of the necessary materials and equipment to produce wings made of composite materials for the MS-21. And within an extraordinarily short time, 18 months, the Russians developed and produced their own. And I ought to just quickly say that you would often see the MS21 referred to in the West as the MC21, but of course MC, the C in Russian, in Cyrillic, is pronounced as an S, and that's why I refer to it as the MS21 as opposed to the MC21. But anyway, to continue, Armstrong's article. Past sanctions have given Russia a degree of immunity against future sanctions. Of course, these strategists don't miss this one. Prevent Nordstrom II from going into operation in the event of a Russian attack. What they haven't the wit to understand is that stopping Nordstrom II will only cost Moscow money, of which it has plenty, but it will cost Germany much more. It's a curious state of mind that threatens enemies by damaging allies. The weapons they suggest are Javelin anti-armor missiles and Q-36 counter-battery radar systems, as well as a Stinger and other anti-aircraft missiles. There won't be a chance to use them. If the Ukrainians provoke a Russian reaction, it will resemble this story. And then he quotes in Russian a phrase which essentially means that the Russians will annihilate the Ukrainian army in short order. And then again, with Armstrong's further comments as to the threat of NATO bolstering its deployments to its eastern flank, taking the British Army as an example, cuts, not increases, are the reality. As it is now, it has one fully staffed infantry battalion. The US Army isn't much better. And then at the very end he says, nobody in Moscow cares anymore about statements and consultations. The withered carrot that makes up the final suggestion amounts to talk to Russia if it admits its sins. Too late, Moscow's not in the mood. And this is true. Now, before I go on, I'm going to just come back to the topic of these Russian guarantees, these demands for Russian guarantees. To my mind, nothing that the Russians are demanding is objectively unreasonable. The United States didn't fight to defend Georgia in 2008. It won't fight to defend Ukraine today. In fact, there is no conceivable situation in which the United States will fight to defend Ukraine. Given that that is so, why continue to pretend that these two countries will one day become members of NATO when that has in effect already been ruled out? Why endanger the peace of Europe and ultimately the credibility of the Western alliance by insisting on a commitment to open-ended expansion of NATO that has already in effect been discredited and which has failed? So conceding that the situation, that the position of having Ukraine in NATO, that NATO eastward expansion has ended, well, that actually concedes nothing of any substance. It ought to be an easy thing to concede. What about the other more strong Russian demands, dismantling all that NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe? Why is that NATO infrastructure in Eastern Europe? Well, the explanation is that NATO infrastructure is needed to deter Russian aggression. The Russian aggression that people are referring to is the alleged Russian aggression against Ukraine. But it isn't, according to NATO, deterring the risk, the danger of Russian aggression against Ukraine. We've seen that NATO has already accepted that in the event that there was a war between Russia and Ukraine, all that NATO infrastructure, all that armament in Eastern Europe, all of that would serve no purpose at all. It would be completely redundant. Well, of course, you could go on. You could argue further that you need all that machinery there, all those troops there, because, well, if the Russians manage to win in Ukraine, the appetite might grow with the eating. They might march into Eastern Europe as well. I don't believe that there is a single person in authority in the West, in Western capitals, who believe that that is a real danger, who genuinely believe that the Russians have any kind of agenda to march on Prague or Warsaw or anywhere else. The only situation, the only circumstance where something like that might happen would be if there was a general war, and the only thing that could trigger such a general war would be an escalation of the conflict in and around Ukraine. Given that that is so, the most sensible and obvious thing to do is to defuse the crisis in Ukraine, and the most effective way to do it is by cancelling that promise that Ukraine and Georgia and all those other former Soviet republics will one day become members of NATO. At that point, tensions in Europe become diffused, and we can at that point also start to see a drawdown of forces both in Eastern Europe and, no doubt, beyond a certain point on the Russian side. So it makes total sense, actually, to agree to these Russian proposals. The only circumstance in which they could be seen as a capitulation, if one agrees to them, is simply that, from a Western point of view, it would trigger a massive loss of face. It would enrage some people in Europe, especially, but a few also in the United States, who are on some kind of ideological crusade, which has Russia in its sights. And the right thing, the obvious thing to do, is to face these people down. The problem is that even though these Russian demands, taken by themselves, are not unreasonable and do actually offer a way out of the present crisis in Europe, as that article in the Financial Times said, it is politically impossible for the moment to grant them. So there we are, in this extraordinary situation in which the Western powers, the United States, Wendy Sherman, goes into that negotiating chamber in Geneva on the 9th of January, empty-handed, against Sergei Ryabkov, this tough, ruthless negotiator with all of these facts at his fingertips, with Ryabkov, of course, knowing that the wind is in his sails. I would love to be a fly on the wall as it happens. Nonetheless, even though I won't physically be there, I will, of course, cover it, and you can expect more discussion of all this issue from me. For what it's worth, I think we are going to see some movement after the talks in January. I think that the United States will make this offer to start withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe. I think they will be dismayed when they find that the Russians pocket it and come back and start demanding more, because I expect that is exactly what the Russians are going to do. I also suspect that the Russians will refuse and rule out any reciprocal concessions or major concessions from our side, from their side. If they do make what appear to be concessions, I am going to speculate in advance that on detailed analysis, they will turn out to be no such thing. But anyway, we will come and see what happens. But I think that the United States, in this situation, has really little option but to play for time, even though, in reality, time is on Russia's side as its position in Eastern Europe gets stronger, as the military and economic and geopolitical balance tilts ever further in its favour. Well, thank you for joining me today for this programme. I look forward to you joining me in future programmes, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programmes with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please remember to check out Alex's own channel and also to go to our other platforms, most especially to Locals, where we, that is to say Alex and I, the Duran, post lots of exclusive material, where I do live streams now every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time, and where we have a thriving community, many of whose members also publish sometimes exceptional exclusive content also. And of course, if you join that community, you can do so as well. And we are also now present on plenty of other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and the new free speech platform SuperU. And you can also support us, if that's what you wish to do, via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, you can go to our shop, links under this video also, and buy yourself the wonderful merchandise that you will find there, our famous magic mugs and all the rest. And lastly, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video. And it only remains for me to thank you for joining me again today and to wish you a very good day.